Ooh. Okay, let's do a quick, brief history of reflections in video games, because it's actually really cool. In the 2D sprite-based era of gaming, the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, they had dedicated hardware separated for backgrounds and sprites and things like that. So to show reflections, they just rendered out mirror copies of sprites in the world and applied a little overlay over top of them to make it look like a reflection. It was cheap, it was easy, it looked great for the time, and it worked. But it didn't work as we moved away from those consoles. That's where the early to mid-90s technology called cube maps come in. Cube maps are reflections based on basically taking the environment that the player is supposed to see around them and turning it into a 2D flat texture that you put on the object that's supposed to be reflective. It's cheap because it's just the same as the texture that would already be applied to the object. It's easy in concept, but it doesn't necessarily look super great. In theory, in those games, the player isn't going to be stopping and looking at the reflections. They're just going to be moving super fast so they don't see the details. But typically these are blurry, low detail, and they don't update in real time. So however you lock them in when you built the texture, that's how it looks. It doesn't show the player, doesn't show NPCs, any details like that. And if you change the environment during the development process, then you have to go through and re-change all those reflection textures, which is kind of tedious. But cube maps were used for a very long time in the early 3D era of consoles, from PS1 to some of the PS2 and Xbox games. However, they're still used in modern games. For example, Doom Eternal still used cube map-based reflections for all of their reflections until they got the ray tracing update. So it didn't look great. Ray tracing looked way better, but a lot of modern games still use it because it was a lot cheaper to run, especially compared to what they moved on to next. As we got into the early 3D era games in the PS2, Xbox, GameCube, and Wii generation of consoles, they wanted something more, reflective, more realistic looking that really sold the look, especially for mirrors and things like that. And for that, they went with the reflection style mentioned in the video I stitched, which are planar reflections. And with planar reflections, in order to show a super reflective surface, they literally just rendered a second copy of the world in the player and mirrored it back to you. And if you use cheats or a debug code or whatever, you can glitch into that mirror world and do some crazy stuff. But that was super expensive to render because you're rendering twice the load. Planar reflections would be used well into the Xbox 360 and PS3 era of games, but mostly died off after that point in favor of this new one, which kinda sucks. The new form of reflection is screen space reflections, which only render the reflections of what the player sees in front of them. So that means as you turn the camera, you see the reflection detail changing, and buildings and environment objects can pop in and out of detail, which is really distracting. I don't like it, but most games use it these days. And finally, we make it to ray tracing, where it's way more realistic. You shoot rays out of the camera to bounce off of everything and provide it like real life. Same thing with path tracing. Way more realistic, but way more expensive to run.